The sun hammered straight down on the palms, flattening the colors until everything looked bleached, green, beige, khaki, the red of clay sticking to boots. A Stuart light tank idled at the edge of the clearing, exhaust coughing in irregular bursts. Its riveted plates shimmered as if melting. Inside, the smell was petrol, sweat, and canvas. A private leaned against the turret and wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist. "Paper armor," he muttered, half mockery, half disbelief, while a pair of infantrymen on a smoke break snorted behind him. One flicked ash onto the roots of a strangler fig and spat. "What's next?" he said. "Pencils for machine guns." They laughed louder this time, because laughter traveled easily in jungles before bullets did. Beside them, Sapper Harold Briggs, Royal Australian Engineers, pulled a strip of oiled Kraft paper from a crate. It was taut, amber, almost translucent in the sun, and looked exactly like school wrapping paper. He layered it against a cut patch of canvas and began brushing on the resin. Each stroke left a sour chemical smell that floated across the clearing. The Stuart's commander, Lieutenant Colin Barrow, leaned out of his hatch and squinted. "We're not making bloody schoolbooks, Briggs." Briggs didn't look up. "No, sir," he said. "Books don't stop 6.5 rifle rounds." Behind him, one of the infantry, Lance Corporal Miller, muttered just loud enough, "Neither does paper." What no one said, what no one needed to say, was that proper steel couldn't reach Papua fast enough. The sea lanes were a knife fight. Every spanner, every shell, every inch of armor had to be argued, shipped, stored, and somehow dragged through marsh and kunai grass to the front. The Stuarts were thin-skinned as it was, meant for speed not slugging, and the Japanese Type 38 rifles were finding their gaps from the jungle flanks where nothing ever stayed quiet for long. So the engineers improvised. They layered paper, canvas, and linseed oil. They stretched, glued, hammered. They called it composite sheathing, but the line troops called it not enough, or absurd, or simply paper armor. A rumor said headquarters wouldn't sign off unless someone demonstrated it with a live round, but no one volunteered to sit in the tank for that experiment. Barrow's men climbed down to help Briggs set the final sheet as the wind shifted. Cicadas screeched from the treeline in sudden waves. A distant burst of gunfire made everyone pause, not close enough to be urgent, but close enough to remind them why they were here. Barrow finally said, "If it buys a second, it buys a second." Briggs nodded, almost relieved someone understood the math. 30 seconds could be a lifetime for a tracked machine in a jungle ambush. 5 seconds could mean gear up, gear down, or escape. 1 second could mean the difference between a round entering the turret seam or glancing off into the underbrush. But infantry was infantry, jokes were armor. "How many layers this time?" Miller called out. 7, Briggs said. 8 at the turret cheeks. 8, the corporal's eyebrows shot up. "Saving us from origami attack, are we?" Briggs could have snapped back. Instead, he held the strip up to the sunlight, letting it glow pale gold. The resin dripped slow and thick from the corner of the cloth. It looked like honey. "You ever seen a bullet tumble?" Briggs asked. The corporal hesitated. "Tumble." Briggs set the strip down. "Doesn't take a brick wall to stop one, just needs to change its mind mid-flight." The infantry didn't answer. Not because they agreed, only because no one liked to admit they didn't understand ammunition physics in front of an engineer. A runner came sprinting out of the palms, barely 20, sweating like a tap, with a message cylinder clutched under his arm. He grabbed a breath before speaking. "Patrol sighted Japs west of the creek," he panted. "Scoped rifles, close." Barrow snapped the hatch open fully. "How close?" "Half a mile, maybe less. They're moving like they know something, here." Everyone turned to the tree line. The jungle was still, too still. The cicadas had gone silent. Barrow pointed at the crew. "Mount up, test drive the bloody schoolbooks." The engine roared as the Stuart lurched forward, tracks grinding on split bamboo laid as makeshift flooring. Briggs slapped the last length of canvas onto the turret cheek as the commander disappeared inside, then stepped back as the tank crawled past him toward the creek. Miller flicked his cigarette away, spine tight now. The jokes didn't travel as easily with the cicadas gone. The air smelled of resin, hot steel, and the sour metallic scent of an approaching firefight. No one expected the Japanese to be waiting for them just beyond the bend, rifles leveled, patience in their shoulders, and 1,000 miles of jungle strategy behind their sights. And none of the laughing infantry had yet seen what 6.5mm rounds did when they met Kraft paper that refused to behave like paper. Because sometimes the jungle changed its mind about physics. The creek was narrow, no more than a dozen feet across, and choked with reeds that bent low under their own soaked weight. The Stuart eased through the mud, bow waves of brown water curling off its idlers. The crew inside worked in murmurs, hands steady, faces slick with sweat. Swinging a turret in dense jungle felt like dragging a dining table through a broom closet. Every branch wanted to snag something important. Barrow peered through the episcopes. "Watch the right bank," he said. "That's where I'd put rifles." The driver, Trooper Nev Ellis, clicked the steering levers. The tank snorted forward, raising a flock of insects from the ferns. Everything smelled green and rotten, like wet rope and fungus. Then came the first shot. A sharp, dry snap, too clean to be anything but a rifle. The round clipped a fern frond and sparked against the turret cheek. Ellis flinched. The gunner swore. Barrow didn't blink. "Type 38 rifles," Barrow muttered. "Small caliber, high patience." Another volley answered, this time from the opposite bank. 8 shots, fast, practiced, almost polite. They struck in a staggered rhythm. Cheek, glasses, mantlet, hull again, and somewhere below the turret ring. Inside, it sounded like someone beating the tank with steel knitting needles. But the strange part wasn't the sound. It was what didn't happen afterward. No ricochet whine, no screaming metal, no tiny cone of spall glittering in the turret like cruel confetti. Just dull, abrupt, anticlimactic thuds like a fist into wet sand. Barrow tapped the turret plate. "Gunner, spot that muzzle flash." The gunner pivoted the 37, eyes pressed to scope. Far bank, 2 trees right of the bend, 3 shooters, maybe 4. "Engage." The cannon cracked like a thunder whip, and the recoil shoved the turret backward against Briggs's precious paper sheathing. The round hit somewhere in the ferns, leaves turned into a cloud. The Australians on foot ducked behind roots and stones. They couldn't see the shooters, the jungle refused to show its cards, but they could see the bullets stitching the Stuart's sides. And the strangest thing, the layering didn't tear, it dimpled, flexed, absorbed. Miller stared, mouth open. "You seeing that?" Private Kemp blinked twice, papers eating them. That wasn't scientific, but it was true enough. The Kraft paper canvas composite did what Harold Briggs had prayed it would do. It slowed the round just enough to tumble it. A Type 38 6.5 projectile was sharp and stable in flight, but once compromised, once robbed of its clean spin, it lost ambition. It pancaked. It crumpled. It did not perforate. Inside the tank, Barrow pressed his glove along the turret cheek. Warm, slightly sticky with resin, but no hole. "Gunner," Barrow said, voice low, steady, "walk that bank." The 37 fired again, and again. The Japanese rifles fell silent. Silence in jungles was rarely peace, it was calculation, but for a moment the only noise was the Stuart's panting engine and the rasp of boots moving across gravel. A distant shout, not English. The enemy withdrew, ghost quick, because wasting riflemen on a tank that didn't behave like a tank was bad arithmetic. When the patrol re-emerged on the near bank, the tank was idling in place, paint frayed, paper armor bruised but intact. Miller stepped forward as Ellis popped the driver's hatch. "You're joking," Miller said, staring at the impact points. "That should've." "Should've what?" Barrow climbed out, sweat tracing lines down the dirt on his cheek. "Gone through, bounced, set the tank on fire." Miller swallowed, "Just not that." Briggs jogged up from the rear with a notebook under his arm. He ran a thumb across the nearest dent, eyes shining like a man who'd been validated by physics itself. "Tumbling rounds," he said. "Exactly what I told you." But the thing that held everyone's attention wasn't the dents. It was the smell. A faint woody sweetness, resin warmed by rifle heat, mixing with canvas and petrol. It was the smell of something improvised refusing to behave like something improvised. Barrow pointed at two darker dents near the mantlet. These were close, he said, if that plating wasn't up. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. 6 months earlier, a Jap sniper round had slipped through a visor gap and taken a gunner through the jaw. That memory still sat in the battalion like a rusted nail, unseen until you stepped on it. Kemp nudged Miller. "Say it," he whispered. "Say what?" "That you were wrong." Miller hesitated. The jungle hummed again as the cicadas found their courage. "I wasn't wrong," Miller said finally, "just premature." Briggs barked a laugh, first laughter of the morning that didn't feel like mockery. "Premature's what keeps tankers alive," he said, "and what kills them if they forget." Barrow folded a map across the tank's glasses. "Enemies testing angles," he said. "Next time won't be rifles, could be grenade bundles, could be a bloody boys, could be anything they drag through those trees." Miller ran a hand along the bruised paper. "Still paper," he said softly. Barrow didn't look up from the map. "Paper that buys time," he said. "Time is armor." Briggs capped his resin can. "And armor changes minds." But he wasn't talking about the Japanese. He was talking about the infantry who'd spent the morning laughing and were now wondering, quietly, privately, what else paper could stop. What else could be layered? What else could be bent into a shield when steel refused to come? Because if the enemy adapted, and they always adapted, then the jungle would demand stranger answers. And Papua was nowhere near done asking its questions. The clouds broke without warning, thin sheets of rain sliding through the canopy and tapping against the Stuart's turret like impatient fingers. Papua never asked permission to change moods. One moment the air was white with heat, the next it smelled of wet mulch and rust. Briggs sheltered under a scrap of canvas, flipping pages in his field notebook. Numbers streamed down with pencil smudges: velocity, grain weight, angle of incidence, estimated tumble rates. His handwriting shook slightly, half from rain, half from adrenaline still leaking out of his bloodstream. Miller watched him from a few paces away. "You always draw graphs in combat." Briggs didn't look up. "Combat's when graphs matter." "You're a strange man, sapper." Briggs finally snapped the notebook shut. "Strange keeps tanks from being coffins." Barrow called the section to attention near a fallen palm that served as a makeshift table. The map spread across its slick bark was pinned down with rifle magazines and a wrench. The paper squares wilted at the edges, soaking in the rain like cloth. Barrow traced a finger along the creek line. "Japanese probed from here," he said. "Small unit, recon or a sniper pair with escorts. They tested the tank's skin and broke contact." "And," Ellis asked, "and they'll tell someone." That was the arithmetic of jungle war. Nothing stayed local. A 3-round burst here became doctrine 5 valleys away. The enemy learned fast, sometimes faster than Allied command believed. "But they were rifles," Kemp said. "What's a rifle gonna do to a tank, paper or no paper?" Barrow's jaw tightened. "This is Tobruk. This is Europe. Jungle kills tanks in weird ways. You don't need steel, you need angle, you need surprise. You need 10 men with grenades and time to breathe." Briggs nodded. "And if they figure out the sheathing trick, they might skip rifles altogether, try higher velocity or incendiaries." The word hung in the steam. Incendiaries. No tanker kept a light stomach at that thought. Miller jammed a fresh magazine into his Owen gun. "So what? We patched the damn thing in papier-mâché until the war over." Briggs didn't answer. Instead, he walked up to the turret cheek and pressed his fingernail into the dent left by the first volley. The resin had hardened over the pulp, making a smooth crater like a fingerprint in amber. "You think this is about paper," Briggs said, "but it's not. It's about layers. Layers confuse energy, slow it, spread it, make it rethink what it's doing." he tapped the dent. That's what armor is, a negotiation with physics. Miller looked around, as if expecting someone to laugh. No one did. Somewhere deeper in the palms, a single rifle cracked, then two more, then silence. Patrols were bumping into patrols. No one pressed the issue long. Both sides were feeling the edges of the battlefield like blind men mapping a room. Barrow folded the map. We push east at dusk, keep the Stuart in the middle. If the Japs try to flank, they'll get a good look at Briggs's schoolbooks. Schoolbooks with attitude, Kemp added. Rain intensified, cascading down fronds in silver streams. The soaked Kraft armor drank it in. Resin softened just enough to smell like linseed and wet rope. Miller ran a hand across it and felt grit from the bullet impacts lodged in the fibers. He thought, though he didn't say it, about how close those shots had landed to the turret ring. He thought about the gunner's shirt from months earlier, stiff with blood around the collar, carried back to camp in silence. Jungle mathematics. Cost always paid in flesh before steel arrived. Dusk slid down the canopy as if someone were dimming the lights. Patrol moved out, 2 squads forward, tank centered, machine gun team riding flank. The Sioux Bend Road was barely a road, just roots and flooded ruts that swallowed boots up to the ankle. As the Stuart crawled forward, its composite panels brushed branches that left ribbons of sap behind. Fireflies hovered around the exhaust like floating tracer rounds, winking in and out through blue smoke. Kemp whispered, "If they hit us from the right again." "They won't," Barrow said. "Different angle tonight, they're adjusting too." The first indication appeared not as gunfire, but sound, an irregular metallic rattle, distant and deliberate, not rifle bolts, not footsteps. Grenades in bamboo baskets. Briggs heard it too and felt his stomach knot. "Barrow," he called, "they're not interested in rifles anymore." Branches parted on the ridge ahead. Shapes moved low, shoulders hunched, arms tucked, motion quick but silent. "Contact," someone yelled. The tank's 37 embarked a bright muzzle flash that punched a hole in the twilight. But the ridge was already alive, figures sliding downhill with baskets swinging from their arms like fishermen carrying bait. Miller threw himself behind a trunk. Kemp hit the ground hard. The Japanese broke out of the foliage and charged across the gully, grenades clacking inside wicker like stones in a dry can. The Stuart pivoted, tracks tearing up roots, trying to bring the Hull MG to bear. But the flanking party wasn't aiming for the tracks or the glasses. They were aiming for the turret and the new absurd armor everyone had laughed at that morning. Because if rifles couldn't poke through a schoolbook, grenades just might teach a different lesson. And the jungle loved to test theories. The charging shapes were shadows at first, blurred silhouettes with cloth-wrapped helmets and bare calves reflecting slivers of moonlight. The wicker baskets clacked against their thighs, a sound that didn't belong in war until suddenly it did. Barrow yelled through the turret, gunner short range, traversing left. The 37 couldn't depress low enough. The Hull Browning took over, rattling a line of bright sparks across the slope. Leaves shredded, dirt spat. A charging soldier folded backward mid-stride, basket flying from his hands and tumbling down the incline in a spray of gravel. But 3 more reached the gully floor. Miller leaned from behind a root and stitched 2 bursts from his Owen gun, burp, 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 short and mean. The air smelled instantly of cordite and wet soil. Kemp's rifle joined him, bolts clacking as he cycled rounds that sounded too calm for what was happening. The Japanese attackers swung wide, hugging the Stuart's blind right flank. That was textbook. That was doctrine. Tanks were coffins from the sides. Everyone knew it, even men who'd never seen one before arriving in Papua. Barrow ducked his head inside the turret. "Ellis, rotate us fast." But the roots and muck turned rotation into a stubborn groan. The tracks spat mud, but refused to pivot quickly. Briggs felt the moment stretch, an engineer watching his theory about layers and tumbling rounds collide with a threat he hadn't graphed. Grenades didn't tumble. They didn't care about physics until the fuse ran out. and then they cared all at once. The first basket emptied. 4 Type 97 grenades spilled across the Stuart's sponson with a blunt wooden clatter. One bounced off the canvas armor and slid into the muck below. The others sat still, fuses hissing like insects chewing through matchsticks. "Move!" Kemp screamed. Miller didn't need telling twice. He threw himself flat as the grenades erupted. The blast was sharp and metallic, not cinematic. Hollywood lies about explosions, real ones snapped like a hammer against the ribs. Shrapnel sprayed the paper armor, chewing through the outer layers and peppering the turret's skirt with pockmarks. Briggs ducked behind a banyan root and then peeked up, incredulous. The composite held, torn, scorched, but holding. The grenades had been thrown blind, too low to wedge under the turret ring, too far from the hatches. One fragment punched through a thin spot near the intake grill and clanged around inside before dying with a sad metallic rattle. Ellis cursed, but no one was bleeding inside. Barrow popped up just long enough to see the second wave on the ridge, 2 soldiers with baskets, one with a satchel charge slung across his chest like a messenger bag. Not rifles anymore. This was how the jungle killed armor, by touching it. The hull Browning tore open again. The satchel carrier stumbled, tried to regain balance, then toppled backward down the slope. The satchel skidded into a fern patch and sparked against a rock, fuse igniting in a sputtering glow. "Keep DOWN," someone shouted. The patch detonated, dirt, bark, and moss erupting upward in a green fountain. The blast sent a pressure wave across the gully that rattled teeth and drove the Stuart half an inch deeper into the mud. Silence followed, brief, artificial, wrong. Miller lifted his head. "They gone." Kemp shook his head before anyone answered. Jungle doesn't leave that clean. Branches shivered above the ridge. Maury movement, this time slow, deliberate thinking, the kind of movement that meant the first attack had been a probe, not a decision. Barrow climbed halfway out of the turret, rainwater dripping from his chin. He ran a glove across the damaged sheathing. Where the grenades had struck, the Kraft paper was swollen and blackened, but still intact, fibers fused by heat into something tougher than either canvas or paper had any right to be. Briggs scrambled up beside him, eyes wide. "It rebonded," he whispered. "Resin's thermoplastic under blast. It spread the impact." Miller stared, as if Briggs had begun speaking Sanskrit. "English, mate." "It didn't shatter," Briggs translated. "It changed shape to stay alive." Barrow didn't smile. Commanders didn't indulge in wonder during fights, but his voice softened by half a degree. "Good work, sapper." The compliment barely registered before a third noise cut through the gully. Not rifle, not grenade. A deep, coughing bark, mechanical and predatory. Kemp's eyes widened. "That's not infantry." Barrow froze, listening. Another bark, then metal tracks grinding against stone. The Japanese hadn't just brought grenades. They'd brought something on tracks. A tank or something like one. The Stuart's engine revved instinctively, like a horse hearing another horse scream. Rain hissed harder against the leaves, the gully filled with steam. Briggs tucked his notebook into his shirt, as if knowledge might be armor too. Barrow slid fully into the turret and sealed the hatch. "All crews ready," he said. "We're not the only ones improvising tonight." Because somewhere beyond the ridge, behind vines and shadows, another machine was clawing its way toward them. And in Papua, machines never met quietly. The sound came first, tracks grinding over stone, then sinking into mud, then climbing again. A struggling rhythm, as if the machine wasn't built for this jungle but refused to admit it. Rain trickled down through layers of canopy and hissed against hot metal somewhere beyond sight. Kemp wiped water from his eyes and whispered, "Type 95. Miller squinted into the tree line. "Could be. Little Hargo makes sense here." Hargo, a Japanese light tank, thin steel, fast enough, armed with a 37 of its own. Not a monster, But in the green maze of Papua, any machine with a gun was an event, because tank duels in jungles weren't supposed to happen at all. Trees made fools of doctrine. The ridge trembled as the Hargo pushed through vines and saplings. Branches slapped its riveted hull like angry hands. Damp leaves clung to its glacis. You could barely see it until it was already pointing in your direction, jungle camouflage done by the terrain itself. Barrow watched through his scopes, jaw set. Gunner stand by armor piercing, don't fire until we see angle. The Stuart's 37 could kill a Hargo clean if it hit the turret or hull square. But in the jungle nothing was square. Everything was leaves, roots, shadows, and rain distorting geometry. The Hargo halted at the ridge, hull angled down into the gully. Its commander raised a spotting scope through the cupola, black oilskin cloak glistening with rain, scanning for the infantry patrol he expected to be alone, unsupported, exposed. Then his scope froze. He saw the Stuart. The machines stared at one another like animals recognizing the same hunger. The Hargo barked first, its 37 cannon spitting a flash that punched through the gloom. The shell struck the Stuart's glacis and ricocheted upward, sparks blooming like fireflies. It hadn't hit square, no penetration. Inside, Ellis swore, half from fear, half from anger. Barrow didn't flinch. Traverse 2 degrees left, on my mark. Miller and Kemp scrambled to new angles, trying to flank the Japanese infantry that ghosted alongside their tank, rifles low, bayonets slick with rain, grenades ready in case machines failed. The Hargo fired again, this time lower. The round ripped a chunk from the Stuart's front mudguard and buried itself in the clay bank behind the crew. Mud sprayed the air. The infantry swore. The jungle seemed to shrink around them. Mark! The Stuart's 37 thundered. The recoil smashed into the turret walls. The barrel spat a bright lance through rain and steam. The AP round crossed the gully and struck the Hargo's turret ring, exactly the place where rivets began to sweat under stress. The Japanese light tank jolted, tracks biting deep, turret hitching. The enemy commander ducked back inside. Smoke leaked from around the cupola like sighs through clenched teeth. But it wasn't dead. The Hargo lurched forward, down the slope, trying to close the distance. At 20 meters, jungle duels weren't about gunnery, they were about audacity. Miller fired into the infantry escort, forcing them behind buttress roots. Kemp kept to the right, catching a grenadier trying to slip around for a throw. The Owen gun's burps sounded like someone ripping wet cloth. The Hargo hit the gully floor with a splash and swung its turret, cannon searching for the Stuart's flank. Barrow's voice was steady, steadier than anyone's heartbeat deserved to be. Load AP, 2 more, we finish it. Rain hammered the machines. Steam curled from the exhaust stacks. The jungle glowed faintly under moonlight refracted through storm clouds. It was a stage built for a duel no doctrine manual would have written. Briggs crouched behind the Stuart's sponson, fingers pressed to the torn Kraft armor. The composite was soaked, resin warm from the grenade blast, fibers slick with water and grit. Improvised armor had never been tested against a tank before, not anywhere, not in any book. The Hargo's gunner found his angle first. A muzzle flash bloomed from the enemy turret, too close, too fast. The shell smashed into the Stuart's right cheek. Not the steel cheek. The paper one. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. A 37 high-velocity round had hit a surface meant for rifle fire and grenade shrapnel. Physics had entered the conversation with entirely new stakes. Briggs watched, stunned, as the Kraft canvas composite didn't shatter. It flexed horribly, fibers stretching like taut sinew. The round punched through the outer paper layers but lost spin and began to yaw. It tumbled, like a drunk boxer swinging off balance, and struck the steel beneath at a stupid angle. The steel held. The shell ricocheted into the mud, detonating harmlessly in a shower of wet dirt. Barrow didn't wait for anyone to marvel. Fire! The gunner sent a second AP round straight through the Hargo's turret front. This time the rivets blossomed outward like tiny metal flowers. The cupola hatch burst open. A plume of smoke climbed skyward, slow, dark, final. The Hargo stopped moving. Infantry scattered into the palms, slipping between roots and mist until the jungle swallowed them whole. Silence followed, thick, humid, reverent. Water dripped from ferns. The Stuart's engine idled like a tired animal. The smell of resin, cordite, and burnt oil mixed in a strange alchemy. Briggs pressed his palm against the paper cheek again, half expecting it to crumble. Instead it throbbed with heat. And that's when Kemp muttered the line that no one expected to hear in a war fought with steel. Paper just stopped a tank. Miller huffed a laugh, the kind that didn't know if it belonged to amazement or dread. But the jungle wasn't finished yet. Because a battlefield that could pit paper against armor had much stranger lessons waiting in the dark. Dawn came dim and half-formed, as if the sun were hesitant to intrude on what had happened in the night. Mist clung low to the gully, pooling around the wrecked Hargo like steam rising from a butcher's block. No one talked at first. Men in jungles didn't rush mornings after fights. They let silence count the bodies that hadn't been. Miller kicked a bit of bamboo aside and crouched beside the enemy tank. The turret front was torn open, rivets peeled back, steel bent into jagged petals. He tapped the armor with the butt of his Owen, listening to the hollow ring of something that had lost its purpose. "Funny thing," Miller said, "looks tougher in pamphlets." Barrow joined him. He didn't touch the tank. He simply observed, the way men observe gravestones they didn't expect to stand over. "Jungle hates machines," he said, "kills them like animals, makes them crawl before it eats them." Kemp found a burst canteen near the ridge, still warm with tea. "They weren't green," he said quietly, "knew what they were doing. Grenades first, then tank." "Adaptation," Briggs murmured as he took notes. "Enemy sees a new defense. Enemy finds a new offense. We answer, they answer, on and on until someone runs out of ideas or time." Miller frowned. Never seen paper beat steel before. Briggs tore a strip from the damaged panel. It peeled away like bark, revealing resin-soaked fibers layered over canvas. "It didn't beat steel," he said. "It cooperated with it." He held the strip up to the light, water dripping from its edges. "Steel gives strength. Paper gives compliance. Grenades like to shatter hardness. Rifles like to penetrate rigid things. Neither knows what to do with confusion." "Armor by confusion," Miller scoffed. "We'll write that in the manuals." But he didn't laugh at his own sarcasm this time. Down the gully, stretcher-bearers moved between ferns. They covered bodies one at a time, gently, as if apologizing for the indignity of war. The jungle swallowed the noises, canvas rustling, boots sinking, whispered prayers. Ellis climbed out of the Stuart and leaned against the hull, wiping his hands with an oil-stained cloth. His knuckles were raw, eyes ringed with soot. "Engine took mud in the lower intake," he said. "Fan spindle's cranky, but she'll drive." Barrow nodded. "We move at noons." "Destination?" Kemp asked. "The Sioux Bend Road. Engineers need to know what we found. Command won't believe it without eyes on." Briggs closed his notebook. "They won't believe it even when they see it." Rain had washed the stink of cordite from the air, but the resin smell lingered, sweet and chemical, like varnished wood baking in sunlight. It was the smell of improvisation, surviving its own gamble. As the patrol shouldered gear and prepared to move out, Miller paused at the turret. He pressed a finger into the cratered Kraft sheathing, now hardened into warped bowls of amber and ash. "Feels wrong," he said. "What does?" Kemp asked. "That this is what saved us." Briggs gave the only answer an engineer could give. "War's never about what should work," he said, "only about what does." But the jungle had one more lesson to deliver before the morning was finished. Because as the men stepped onto the Sioux Bend track, they saw a column of wounded infantry limping toward them, Australian, mud-caked, bandaged, shaken. One of them stopped, staring at the Stuart's battered paper armor with a look somewhere between disbelief and awe. "What in God's name is that?" he asked. Barrow didn't hesitate. "Armor," he said. But the wounded man shook his head. "Not armor," he said, "hope." And hope spread faster than doctrine. The battalion tent smelled of wet canvas and stale cigarettes, command's preferred ambience. Maps hung from strings like laundry, dripping from the humidity. Major Creighton sat behind a folding desk, tapping a pencil against a field cup of cold coffee. "So," he said, not looking up, "you're telling me a tank protected by school supplies dueled a Japanese light tank in a ravine?" Briggs took a breath. "Not protected by school supplies, by laminated cellulose fiber composites with." Creighton held up a hand. "Paper sapper, let's not romance it." Barrow placed the damaged strip on the desk. Resin glistened along its torn edge. Behind him, Miller and Kemp waited like witnesses in a trial whose verdict didn't matter, but whose story demanded telling. Creighton picked up the strip, bent it, studied the ripples where blast heat had reshaped the fibers. "And this," he tapped the crater, stopped a 37. "It slowed the round," Briggs corrected. "Forced a yaw, killed its penetration." Creighton finally looked up. "Can you reproduce it?" Briggs nodded. "With more resin, more canvas, better layering, yes." Creighton leaned back. "And what happens when the enemy brings bigger guns or more tanks?" Briggs didn't flinch. "Then we adapt again, layers against layers." Silence settled, brief but thick. Creighton signed a requisition slip and slapped it on the table. "You'll get 2 more Stuarts, limited materials for trials, and no promises beyond that." He looked at Barrow. "But I'll tell Brigade, they'll laugh, then they'll ask if it works, then they'll pretend they supported it all along." "What about doctrine?" Barrow asked. Creighton smirked. "Doctrine takes months, you don't have months." Outside the tent, mechanics were already peeling off damaged panels and laying out new Kraft sheets to dry in the sun. Infantrymen walked past in pairs, slowing as they stared at the makeshift armor, not mocking now, not curious, but thoughtful. War had a way of rewarding anything that kept men alive, regardless of aesthetics. Miller lit a cigarette and exhaled a thin stream of smoke through his teeth. "Funny," he said, "if we'd had steel, we never would have tried paper." Kemp nodded. "Jungle doesn't give you what you want, gives you what you can abuse." Barrow looked toward the track, the gully already fading into rumor and retelling. "Men remember kills," he said, "but armies remember lessons." Briggs thumbed open his notebook again. On a fresh page, he wrote a title in small, neat script. "Composite Field Armor, Note Number 1, Papua Trials." He paused before adding the last line. "Doctrine begins with jokes that stop being funny." A runner approached from the motor pool, breathless, grinning. "Sirs," he said, "you'll want to hear this. Other units are asking if we've got any more of that." He searched for the word, found it, and grinned wider. "Book armor." Miller barked a laugh, this time without bitterness. "Perfect," he said. "First they mock it, then they name it, then they steal it." The runner nodded toward the Stuart. "They're already stealing it." Paper stocks disappeared from the quartermaster. Someone's laminating crates behind the mess tent. Barrow chuckled, just once. "Good, better to spread ideas than funerals." The jungle hummed outside, birds shrieking, insects buzzing, engines coughing awake. Machines would roll again, infantry would vanish into green tunnels, and the enemy would adapt in kind. War in Papua wasn't about glory or neat timelines or metal purity. It was about improvisation under pressure, about the materials at hand and the physics you could bully into cooperation. Sometimes that meant steel. Sometimes that meant canvas. And in 1942, in a jungle that hated machines, sometimes that meant paper.